eliminating global gag rules, and permitting international AIDS funds to be spent in the most useful ways, rather than setting aside 30% of those funds as only being available for abstinence-only programs. We heard in a briefing from a doctor in Kenya, and it was really sad because he was talking about how in his country there are so many women who do not have access to condoms. And that's what they really want, and that's what they really need, and that's what they ask for. But USAID quite often can't give them that. They have to just tell them not to have sex. And the reason it was a sad presentation is he then talked about these women who end up trying to self-abort unwanted pregnancies and how they generally die because the Kenyan hospitals are not really equipped to deal with the results of that. Secular Coalition has also worked against resolutions claiming that our history is that of a Christian nation and that our government should be permitted to endorse religious symbols. And in fact, there's a tremendous amount of revisionist history being foisted on a lot of people out there now, claiming that the founders wanted a Christian nation when all of the historical documentation shows that that was not in any way the secular government that they put together. Bills to take away the court's rights to decide our rights. Opposition to federal funding of the Boy Scouts of America until they discontinue discriminating against members, employees, and volunteers on the basis of religion and sexual orientation. Federal vouchers to religious schools, and a number of other bills. Three areas that we've been working on are a bit larger than these individual bills and earmarks. There are a couple of religion privileging bills, Religious Freedom Restoration Act and Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. We oppose the military being used as a born-again Christian crusade and outrageous abuses of the president's faith-based initiative grants. So I want to go into a little more detail on these three areas. The first, we'll call them RFRA and RLUIPA because the titles are pretty long, are laws which passed in 1996 and 2000, which require courts to treat religious claims differently than non-religious claims or claims from other religions, and to privilege religion over non-religion in land use and zoning regulations, drug law, anti-discrimination civil rights laws, and some other areas, prison rights included. The best example of how the land use part of these laws has been abused is current litigation in Boulder, Colorado, where a megachurch claims that this county of Boulder discriminated against them when it denied a sixth request for a zoning variance, which would have doubled the church's size and curtailed the open space that these regulations were designed to protect. The claim of discrimination comes after Boulder County had approved the first 5 zoning variance requests, each of which, for this church, each of which expanded the church beyond its zoning limitations. And at this point, there's really no discrimination going on, but they're using RLUIPA to claim they should be allowed to do whatever they want to do, regardless of law. As to drug law, we live in a country where our U.S. Supreme Court denies a woman in California, in your state, dealing with cancer, the legal use of medical marijuana. But the UDV Church, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, is permitted to use otherwise illegal hallucinogenic drugs. The Secular Coalition for America doesn't take any position on whether the drug laws should be in place, but we do believe that all Americans should be treated the same regarding any laws which are enforced. If the state interest in making drugs illegal is not sufficient to override the use of such drugs by a church, then it should not be deemed sufficient to be enforced against the patient. Her only disadvantage being that she is not a member of a church which requires her drug use as a sacrament. Now, before any of you get the great idea of starting a church whose tenets are use of medical marijuana, I will tell you that there have been a couple of attempts, and lower courts, it hasn't gone as high as the other cases I mentioned, but so far the lower courts have held that those religions are not sincere religions. So imagine the difficulty or how dangerous it becomes when the courts are placed in the position of determining which religions are sufficiently sincere to receive legal privileges that others do not get. Now, the second category I mentioned that's a bit large and perhaps unwieldy is our military. I've heard from veterans who served before 2005, and they're shocked at the stranglehold on positions of power in the Pentagon and our military that the religious right now has. They are appalled at the atmosphere of proselytizing and the harassment of non-Christians, as well as of Christians who are not identified as born again in today's military. In 2006, the House of Representatives actually passed an amendment to the Department of Defense spending appropriations bill, which would have explicitly allowed military chaplains to proselytize unwilling soldiers. The Secular Coalition works across party lines, and I'm proud to report that Republican Senator Warner from Virginia was the driving force behind quashing that amendment. Maybe there'll be another person who works across the lines with us, and there already are. How many of you have read about Jeremy Hall? It got a lot of press. Just a few of you. A soldier stationed in Iraq, Jeremy Hall, was threatened with punishment when attempting to hold an approved free thought meeting after being challenged for identifying as an atheist when he was asked why he wasn't praying over Thanksgiving dinner. When Hall finally sued to protect his right to hold meetings similar to those held for religious soldiers, he was treated so badly that he expressed fear for his life, not from the admitted dangers of serving in Iraq, but from his own fellow soldiers. The military investigated his claims and determined that there was a real danger that he would be fragged. That means that his fellow soldiers would purposely kill him. And so they stationed him in the U.S. for his own safety, where he continued to receive death threats, by the way. And he was recently passed over for a promotion. He was told that the reason for the denial was that if he would not pray with his troops, he could not lead them. Even at that point, seeing him apply for a promotion leads me to think that this young man in his mid-20s had some thoughts of making the military his career. But at this point, he has now announced that he will leave the military in April of 2009. So if our military wants to retain soldiers, they're going to have to give them back their freedom of conscience. Pentagon officials, one of whom was later assigned to be a liaison in Turkey, a secular nation which is a majority Muslim, appeared in uniform in a fundraising video for the evangelical group Christian Embassy, a group which has become so powerful that the officials who appeared in the video thought it was a quasi-federal organization. We are currently working alongside Military Religious Freedom Foundation and through SCA's member organization, the Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, to bring the over 9,000 complaints which have accumulated over the last 3 years to the attention of members of Congress. And the Secular Coalition for America will hold a press conference on the Monday that Veterans Day is celebrated to highlight the need for a policy which protects the freedom of conscience of all military personnel and to submit the policy we have to recommend to the next president. We did work very closely with Senator Levin to deal with one part of the problem, and that was a procedure called Free Day Away, where military personnel who went to a sort of tent revival would get this great party off base, and everyone else had to stay in their barracks. Senator Levin helped us eliminate that privileging of religion. Faith-based initiatives are another area that is tremendously complex but terribly flawed. When the Freedom from Religion Foundation, a member organization of the Secular Coalition for America, attempted to challenge the unconstitutional activities conducted by the White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to address the alleged constitutional violations, saying that taxpayers have no right to challenge expenditures made by the President or the executive branch agencies, only expenditures made specifically in congressional budgets. This actually added immediacy to our lobbying efforts to convince Congress to take some action on this. But the problems continue, including allegations that the secular social service providers are losing grants because some grant makers are throwing out any grant applications which do not appear to be from Christian groups, that there is no oversight or accountability for how the religious groups are using the money and whether they are following the law regarding limiting the funds to non-proselytizing social service activities, and that these groups are assumed to have good results with no proof of such results merely because they are religious. So groups like Pat Robertson's Operation Blessing received your tax-funded federal grant money, and it did not have to comply with constitutional church-state standards, or at least no one was checking to see if they did. And the most frustrating